So, okay, well, welcome everybody to this, the first webinar of 2024. I'm Catherine Stothart. I'm the Director of Events for BAPT, and I'm delighted that Roy Childs is here with us. It's actually the 35th anniversary of BAPT this year, and so it's particularly fitting that Roy is with us because Roy was a founder member of the Myers Briggs User Group in the UK, which was the forerunner of the British Association for Psychological Type. So it's really great to have Roy here talking about his career in personality type and his thoughts about type for the future. And he's going to be talking with Sarah Perrett, our president, who I'm sure most of you know. And Sarah's got a lovely bunch of roses behind her there. I'm quite envious. Before I introduce Roy and Sarah properly, I just want to share with you a couple of slides about our upcoming events. So can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my slide? Can you see it? Oh, good. Okay, because my screen layout has now changed, so I'm a bit confused. Right, so as you can see from this, today, 31st of January, we're delighted to have Roy Childs with us. Next month's webinar is with Nick Toko, who's a Jungian analyst or in training as a Jungian analyst, and Nick is going to be talking about personality disorders. He actually did a session on this before Christmas, and it was so popular that we're running it again. So if you didn't come last time, think about coming this time. It was really great. And then Sarah runs a monthly session, a type practitioner peer support group, which is an opportunity to discuss with colleagues issues that you've got with using type with your clients or with teams or whatever. It's a really useful group. And then, of course, we got our big conference in April. So 19th and 20th of April, our virtual conference. That is now live on our website. So you can register for that now. Really delighted about that. And in May, we've got John Haxton of the Myers Briggs Company doing a webinar for us on MBTI type and diversity. And in June, 14th and 15th of June, we've got an in-person 2-day workshop, non-residential in London. We had a fantastic time last year, and we've got some amazing speakers this year too. And just one more slide, which is this one, which shows you our keynote speakers for our conference in April. So we've got Dario Nardi, Susan Nash, Roy Childs and John Haxton as keynote speakers. And you can see what a fascinating and topical range of subjects they've got there with climate change, AI, etc. So that's our upcoming events. I'd love to see some of you at them. So I'll just stop sharing and let's get on with this evening's event. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Roy Childs, founder member of the Myers Briggs User Group, which was a forerunner of BAPT, as I said earlier. He's a facilitator, coach, trainer, researcher, and author. He's worked with the giants in the world of personality psychometrics, organizations like Cattell and Schutz, and he's developed psychometrics for the 21st century, notably type mapping. So I'm going to stop talking now. I will keep an eye on chat. If anyone has any questions they'd like Sarah to pose to Roy during this hour session, we're due to finish in an hour at 8 p.m. UK time. Please put them into chat and I'll try to monitor that. So without more ado, Sarah, I will hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Catherine, and such a warm welcome to you, Roy. It is just a real privilege to have you here. So I know everyone's very keen to hear from you. So where I'd love to start is by asking you to cast your mind back to telling us how you first became aware of personality type.
Wow, that's there is a very interesting bit to that, which is that I studied psychology. I studied in Exeter. One of my lecturers was Professor Paul Klein, who is, so he was a professor of psychometrics specifically. And he introduced me to personality assessment using the 16PF, which he majored on. That got me interested, but I remember feeling very perturbed by the oversimplification of psychometrics, about people. And so, and in fact, what was interesting as well, in all the psychology that I did, we had very little on social, very little on psychodynamics, a little bit on Freud, and I think the word Jung was mentioned once. Okay, nothing really of any significance. So certainly then, psychology did not actually consider Jung to be part of what was interesting to study. So it wasn't my psychology that introduced me to Jung, it was the MBTI, because after that, after deciding not to do a PhD at that point, I did various things, traveling, jobs, etc. And I eventually got a job at the NFER with Peter Saville, NFER Publishing Company, which was therefore psychometrics, which was not a field I was interested in, but I was looking for a job. And it was interesting there because NFER was the main publisher of all the psychometrics. 16PF, Gordon, MBTI, FIRO, and lots of other ones as well. And once you're inside there, they needed some experts and you got handed the badge. And I became the person who was responsible for introducing or responding to client queries about, want to use 16PF. Okay, that made me therefore want to learn about these instruments. And so the MBTI was one of them, and it didn't stand out particularly at that point, but it was, so this is 76 to 79 that I was sort of doing that, but I did get interested. And then I heard about, and I don't know how I heard about it, but presumably because of my links with NFER, that someone was suggesting getting together to discuss the use of MBTI. And that person, or the driver for that, was someone called Middy Berry. I don't know if any of you have heard of Middy Berry, but Middy Berry and Jim Maxon, who worked at HP. HP had a very advanced view of how they use their HR staff, and he was allowed 1 day a week to do other stuff. And he was heavily sort of, in America, they started using MBTI much earlier than us. But I remember traveling to Whitney in Oxfordshire for this first meeting with Middy, with Jim Maxon. And that's where I met Anne O'Sullivan, Sally Campbell, Peter Naylor, Ralph Lewis, all these people. And there was a good sort of energy about this little questionnaire. Okay, so that got me more interested to go back and study it. I was at that stage still very cognitive in my approach to this, which is what psychologists are taught. Okay, think it, rationalize it, justify it, etc. And I thought I needed to know more. And that's when Anne O'Sullivan, hello Anne, if you ever watch this, etc., was running these introductions to type at Emmaus House in Bristol. And I went down for a weekend. So in a convent for a weekend sounded a great way to spend some time. And she, Anne, and Edna, her fellow nun, did this amazing double act about, what it was about and what their differences were, etc. And it felt so different from the way in which I'd been looking at the whole question of personality that I got engaged. And much later on, by the way, I sent my parents down to Emmaus House for a weekend to try and sort out some of their issues and difficulties, which they found useful. Okay, but maybe sometimes it's a bit too late. I mean, they weren't bad, but it was just a question of insight and what have you. So that's where it was, and so I was a member. We had, I think the first course in the UK was run by Gordon Lawrence, which was such a, I mean, I think most people thought it was not a very good course and a very good introduction, unfortunately. And so it set me thinking to, what are we doing with this thing? There's the energy, but that's what's being promoted. And during the 80s, which is, this was happening in the 1980s, I was being asked to run courses in FIRO, in 16PF and all of these things. So I became a trainer in these things. And so MBTI was part of that. And I began running courses in MBTI. And then NFER lost the franchise to it and OPP got it. I said, look, I've got this great course. Will you recognize it? And OPP said, yes, of course you can. And so I was running the MBTI training course, which was different from the one that OPP inherited from the USA. And the way I characterize it when we finally, parted company was that the USA one was more, if you like, dominated in its approach, ESTJ style. And my approach was more INFP style. Okay. And I felt there was a great, thing in the whole message about running courses that had these differences, etc. And we won't go into how that fell apart, but basically OPP said, well, we don't want you to run it. It was because we were training more people, I think, than they wanted us to, and that's where their profits were. So we were asked to stop doing it. And during that whole period, I was looking at these other questionnaires and thinking about them and recognizing the weaknesses with all of them. And I became a critic of the psychometric approach. But I was also an advocate of how useful they can be if you understand them properly and use them properly. And so I got into running a whole host of courses on these things. And unlike publishers that were basically saying, this is a great tool, let us teach you how to to use it. Ours were saying, these could be useful, but they're oversold. And our approach to training was more educational than promotional. And I think that made us very popular with certainly some sectors out there. And I still feel that, even though we've got our own tools now that we like to promote, but really through an educational approach to it.
Super. So thank you for that. That's absolutely fascinating, Roy. And thinking about where you came in at life in your first introduction to Jung and in your studying, and then what you were saying is really kind of experiencing it and the usefulness of it and so on. What's your assessment of the landscape now between type instruments and the academic arena?
So as you know, I'm doing the talk at the conference about the way in which type is berated unfairly. It is about exposing the unfairness and the way in which academic psychology. I mean, if you look back to, I had no Jung in my training. Most people have no Jung in theirs, and they pick up the MBTI and they look at it and think of it through their traditional lens. Now, there's a lot of issues with the psychometric lens for understanding people. And I can go on about that at length. But basically, the psychometric model was developed out of, trying to understand intelligence, which is quite a different concept. And even that is not as static as you think, but we think of it as more stable. But we impose then a stable model on values, personality, and all the soft stuff. Rish and I did talk about, rethinking personality and recognizing that these things are much more dynamic. and we need to think about change. So the traditional model, the way it looks at reliability, I don't think is fit for purpose, but it's the thing that all the academics actually go by, and the mantra of reliability and validity is what it is. And not just the academics, but the academics in business schools, they want the things that fit the existing model. So, they look at that. And I think that we need to have a paradigm shift there about, with this more dynamic concept of how people are, who they are, how they adapt, how they change. That model built from IQ is not the right one to go forward. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's
no, it's as you say, it's a huge question, and that is going to be very much what you're going to be talking about at the conference. So we'll really look forward to that. And so coming out of all of this, you started your own business, Roy, and you call yourself Team Focus. And there are quite a number of psychometrics that you have developed yourself. Please talk to us about those and what you've done and why you've done that.
Okay. Well, the starting Team Focus in 1989 was after 8-9 years as an independent consultant. And that independent consultancy was based on my track record of having worked at NFER. And so I had Peter Saville asking me to join SHL. I had ASE wanting me to run all their courses. I did some work for Poe and Candola as well. And that's why I became an independent, because I was getting lots of work and it was reasonably varied. But after 8 or 9 years, I felt I was stuck in, this is what you're known for. And I was thinking about the way in which I was working, which was largely with the psychological lens. And the psychological bias is really around, focusing on the individual. And I was aware of how much that was restricting. I mean, I must admit that underlying the setting up the business as well is I wanted to do more, and I had a rationale for the name Team Focus, which was, if you want to be a business psychologist, you want to affect change in businesses. And the mantra was always, you work from the top and it will filter down. And I was seeing people at the top are normally stuck in what they are. And I didn't get to where I was today just by, they're stuck in where they are. And working from the individual is very difficult. And that therefore the concept of team and the focus on the team was based on the concept that if you want to manage any change, you need to get a small group of committed people pointing in that direction, and they will ripple out. So if you like, Team Focus is trying to draw, the bottom down and the top up approach, and also to recognize that working at the individual level is great. And a lot of people here no doubt do that as individual coaches. But I learned a lot about the value of the group process with Will Schutz, who's a great believer, author of The Fire, for those who don't know, of how, yes, there's a lot of individual learning, but sometimes the group process is far more powerful and accelerating in terms of awareness and change than working at the individual level. And I think that a lot of people from a psychological tradition, they talk about individual and moving towards maybe team stuff. And that's the thing that I promote now more, is we need to be much more flexible in thinking about the way in which we intervene, and that sometimes starting at the group level is actually the biggest accelerator you can have. And you can go back into the individual. So I talk about working from the inside out or working from the outside in. They're both equally valid, and a good facilitator needs to size up, the group that you're working with. So setting up Team Focus was I didn't mention the other sort of selfish bit in that, which was I was dying to do outdoor development work. I just
Okay.
love the idea of being paid to be in the Lake District and sailing down cliffs. And
Yes.
Team Focus was a good name for that. And so,
Mm,
I got invited to start doing that, not having ever done it.
yeah, yeah. So
And
if I can just ask
yeah,
your opinion of our 21st century world. So you started Team Focus 30 plus years ago, and our world has moved to being arguably incredibly individualistic, and it's all about the person and not the team. What are your thoughts on that? What do you think the challenges are for us as
okay.
consultants and type in that?
If you ask a fish, what is the importance of water? What will it say? It will say, what's water?
Yeah.
Um, I'm a co-author of a book called The Relational Lens, and the first chapter in there is the dark matter in organizations. Ask people in organizations, what's the most important? Well, the most important thing in our business is the people. And I
Mm,
say, no, it's not.
mm,
It's how they work together that's the
mm,
most important asset that you've got. It's the relationships that they have, the commitment that they have between them, the communication is how they work together. And so, yes, going more and more to the individualistic, I mean, our whole world is based on that. All recruitment is about get a job role, think of an individual who could fill it, not what skills have we got in the round and what
mm,
extra input can we have. And let's stop trying to select Renaissance man or woman, who's got all the competencies, etc.
mm,
Let's say, what competencies are we already good at? What aren't we? And let's find people who can
mm,
bring complementarity to all of this.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and yeah, I think there is a great thing there as well about therefore not overloading people with, developmental aspirations which are unrealistic. It
mm, mm,
is what can't
mm.
I do? It's just as important as what I can do.
Mm, mm. And what impact do you think that COVID and the working from home and, some people in large organizations now have been onboarded and have worked for 2 years almost completely from a home context? So how do you bring that team group dynamic into your work when you're working with them?
Well, I have had to eat humble pie on this because I was very strongly a get in the room and smell the coffee or the armpits or whatever it is, that you've got. And so, yeah, I was committed to that, even though back in the late 80s, 90s, I was involved in a research program around psychometric feedback, face to face, or using video conferencing as it was then.
Mm,
And what I was amazed at, but I didn't really take on board sufficiently at that point, was that the feedback from the video conferencing seemed more positive than the face to face, which was a shock.
mm,
And trying to understand why. And some of it, I think, was about how people in their own space and talking about it felt they could actually reveal more and get further into it and maybe be more self-reflective than having to respond to a
mm,
person who's in the room. Okay.
mm.
Anyway,
Interesting.
I sort of
Mm,
semi accepted that, but COVID has double accelerated that.
mm,
And
mm,
it
mm.
is the thing I said to you earlier, Sarah, before the session started about our FIRO courses are highly experiential, and they're so experiential that basically it does involve looking at each other in the eyes, touching each other, recognizing our own reactions to personal space, and all of those things, huge things you cannot simulate online. So when I was asked to do an online course, Fire online course, I said it can't be done. There's no way you will get the power of this instrument like that. And 10 rejections later saying, no, I won't, I was finally persuaded. And what you have to do when you're persuaded like that, set the expectations low. So I said, it won't work, but we ran it. And instead of having a 3-day intensive, we had 2-hour sessions weekly interspersed. And it introduces quite a different dynamic, which is not necessarily worse. But what you find with the old method of a lot in a few days is intense. And I think a lot sort of drops off as you walk out the room. And the process that we have now is 2 hours, activity, reflection, bring back, revisit, and you can get very, very personal. I had a group that was from the States, in Asia and Europe, all on one course, some of who had never met. And at the end of that course, they said, we feel so connected. Now, I still think if we'd have been in the room, they'd have smelt the coffee a bit more, but they don't know what they missed as it was hugely. So yes, in this new world, let's not deride this kind of interaction, but let's recognize that certain things are lost, but certain things are definitely gained, I think.
That's really interesting. And just thinking, so thank you for that, Roy, and thinking about team focus and the psychometrics that you use there, what would you, firstly, it might be interesting to know what they are, and how would you say they differentiate from others that are on the market, particularly maybe your type instruments?
Okay, well, I mean, there's sort of more to it than that, because it's basically the philosophy behind what we're doing. Okay. And a key to that is, well, we've got a pretty wide range. We've got ability tests, and we've got some standard verbal, numerical, non-standard abstract. But, in that department, the human brain is much more than verbal and numerical critical reasoning. And so how are they different? We introduce ways of how people think and make decisions when there's ambiguity and complexity, which is the reality of our lives. And I don't know any other psychometrics that try and cover that space, certainly in the same way as we do. And also the fact that the biggest challenge in many jobs is not, logical thinking. It is managing lots of different things. So we've got what we call a memory and attention test, which says, yeah, so I've got people who are, heads like planets, and they can't manage if they're thrown several things at one time. They drop all the balls. So, but let's put that aside, because that's probably not the main interest for this audience. In the other space, if you like, the soft skills space, personality and values and all of that, I think the conversation needs to change from psychometrics to 5 decimal places of accuracy and change, and all the way in which it has been dominated by metrics and statistics, to we are finding a way to use self-report. And let's be honest, self-report is not measuring your DNA. And people forget that. They forget it. Even some in the type community, well, we're measuring type, and you said it was innate. Well, I question whether he really said that, or whether there is a core there, but that's not the critical bit. Okay. And so
what is the critical bit?
The critical bit in terms of, well, coming back to what is self-report, it is that we all have experiences and we develop a narrative about who we are. And that narrative does not come out of our genes solely. It also comes out of our parents and our environment and our experience and things. So when we self-report, it is a great intermingling and tangling up of things that may feel natural and things that feel natural because they're easy and things that are natural because we aspire to them and what have you. And so it's a very complex thing. And so, I mean, one of the great things that I think that I really give credit to Isabel Briggs Myers for is the way in which she was bold enough to challenge the psychological community with, you know, that you don't really think about personality as behavior. It's preference. And that's where a lot of the academics come in. Oh, no, it's got to be behavior. If it doesn't predict behavior, what happens? Well, no, I think that is way off what we're dealing with, because behavior can be chosen and behavior can be flexible and behavior can adapt to the circumstances that we're in. And so to say, well, it's got this point here, it's going to predict that point there. No, because that point there is a different context and there's choice along the way, etc. So I don't buy, and that's at the core of the psychometric validation model, predicting behavior. It is not necessary. So the way I reframe all of that is say, look, let's be more honest. And let's not say we are measuring your personality. We are inviting you to articulate a way of thinking and what you believe about yourself. I call it helping people to articulate their autobiographical narrative. That's what it is. And then you get away from, well, you know, and does it change? And it should be reliable. And if it changes, it's wrong. Because once you say that, you say, oh, my narrative could change. And actually, it would be very sad if my narrative didn't change, you know. And so it automatically gets people into the question of change and development, which is the community that I think is much more, you know, built into, you know, the good use of psychometrics. So self-report is just self-report. So it's what you are saying. Do you realize what you're saying about yourself? And the thing is that the way people think is quite chaotic, really. We've got lots of things go, oh, I'm like this, you know, blah, 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 blah. You can talk to people in the pub and they can be all over the place and even contradict themselves and, yeah, usually contradict themselves, you know, partly truth and partly fiction and whatever. So whatever that narrative is, you know, and if you do go for a chat with someone in the pub, you know, and you ask them, you know, just 10 questions, you get a whole load of things. What a questionnaire does is it pulls it back and gives it some structure and says, do you realize what you're saying? And insight comes because people don't often realize what it is or the implications of what they're saying. But that feedback process can sometimes get people to recognize, am I really? Is that really what I'm saying? Is that really what I mean? You know? And so for me, you know, the good use of any of these psychometrics is a springboard for, is that true? And which is why I use what I call the ACDC model of recognizing what goes into a feedback. Because when people have a questionnaire, because I started the 16PF user group as well as joining the MBTA user group, and watching and listening to people about how they do feedback, you say, well, how did it go? Oh, it was a really good session. What was good about it? They agreed with it.
Yes.
I thought, wow, okay, they agreed with it. So what have you done? You've given them a questionnaire which affirms what they already know, and they say, yeah, that's good. Oh, yeah. Okay. So the ACDC model is, say, affirmation of what they already know. And for a lot of people in feedback, it is about getting to yes, getting them to agree with a profile that's come out, is just the very first bit. And you need some affirmation, otherwise you reject the whole questionnaire. But what you then get is what I call the next bit is C, is where people, that's interesting. Yeah, that's what I was trying to say, because people are very bad at articulating their autobiographical narrative. So it's affirm and then better communication of that. But we're still only in the not having, really shone the light on to the big areas for them. So the next one is ACD, is discovery. Does it say that? Really? I wouldn't have thought that. So I should maybe consider that. Maybe I am more either IJ or P or whatever it is. I wonder why it's come out like that now. Let's explore. I always say feedback is about exploration, not explanation. A lot of psychometrics does not really promote that well enough or strongly enough. I'm sure in this community there's a lot more of that. But the ACDC, the final C is the challenge. Bit where the person said, well, that's wrong. No, that's not right. And so often, and in all these sessions that I've had in the training I've done, people say, oh yeah, well, it can be wrong. It can be wrong.
Yes.
You're saying, so I wonder why it's saying that. Perhaps the questionnaire is rubbish.
Yeah.
Maybe it's picked up on something that should we explore that? And so, and I always say that the challenges, the bits where people disagree are the gold dust. That's where you're going to get the most. When we're in a development frame, we want the challenge that says maybe and reconfiguring and rewriting my autobiographical narrative. And that's what I think we're doing with these is, we are helping people to write the next chapter of their book. They are the book. And if the next chapter is just going to be what the last one was, it's a pretty boring book. So, you're helping people to think again about, and maybe and then you get into the fact that it's not that what I used to say was wrong, it's what I used to say was narrow. It was not, and there's more to me than that. And as we know with Jung, it was that whole thing about how, not the whole thing, but you get to a stage in your life, the midlife crisis, he made a bit about that. He got a lot of money out of midlife crises, etc., which can happen at 20 or 80, midlife not, etc. But it's that point at which you suddenly, probably because we all face mortality at some point, we think, is that it? I've done it. Is that the end of it? And that point, that inflection point where you then go into discovering the other parts of yourself. And that's where type is so, it's so well positioned to help people to start that process, but it's limiting in the way in which it gets into that process as well, and so, other influences on me as well as, Ray Cattell gave me the statistical lens, Will Schutz gave me the hugely experiential lens, and then I met Michael Daniels. Don't know if any of you have heard Michael Daniels, the watchword technique. Self-discovery the Jungian way. And when people go on about well, is there another questionnaire that I can use? Why a questionnaire? Why not a different approach, different method? The watchword technique, it's great. He's got it online. He's just republished it actually as a book. And we're actually going to include it on our new portal in the future of how people can do the watchword technique. But it's basically about how free association can reveal your type, and possibly takes a lot of experience to do this, your archetypes as well. And I do think that all of those things, Jung is not understood. Jung is not understood. And archetypes are wacky, but no, they're not. When you understand them properly, there are these things about how, we all fill, our sort of models of how the world should be in some way, wherever it comes from. And, you're not the perfect mother, you're not the perfect spouse, you're not, all of those things, and so there's a lot there. I think I'm rambling now, but yeah, there's a lot there. Get me back on track, Sarah.
Yeah, so no, that is absolutely fascinating, Roy. Thank you. So what advice would you give to someone who wants to make a career from working with personality type? How do they start? What should their focus be?
Get a better idea of what personality is, because I don't think that personality questionnaires measure personality. Even the NEO, even the 16PF, all of those. What do they do? They tangle together your emotions, your motivations, your attitudes, your behavior, your preferences. And because they correlate, it becomes a factor.
Yeah.
And hold on, that's certainly not where I think about personality, which, as I said earlier, Isabel was brilliant in saying, let's focus on preference.
Yes. Yes.
But it is then recognizing, instead of the rigidity, potential, static nature of thinking about personality and type in that, is to be much more dynamic in our concept of that. And the key element of that is what we've done with the type mapping system, okay, which is to separate being from doing. And once you do that, you've got, well, actually I can do, and here I do different, and here I do. So I'm quite behaviorally flexible, although we find that some people are not. Some people just do. They always do it the same way, etc. But the key to that is underlying it is this basis, this preference, who am I? And then how that acts like, if you like, a fulcrum or an anchor, which sometimes gets me rigidly into there, or sometimes, prevents me from developing the flexibility that I want. And let's remember, Jung said, adaptation is the adaptation both to the world as we find it. We have to do that.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the inner being. And it is both of those. And the being and doing just helps you to address that much more clearly and in a much more Jungian way.
What would be... Sorry, go on, finish your thought,
Well,
Roy.
I mean, other things that in this, I think that there is a desire, I think, coming back to wanting answers and certainty. So I actually do not have a great deal of value for step 1, step 2. Step 2, why? Why step 2? Well, they weren't really sure about their EI, etc. So now we can say, oh, look, but it's these elements in your E that, oh, okay, what's that doing? Getting people to agree. Oh, okay, I can buy it now. It's not the purpose. The purpose is to get the reaction and then to consider and to explore. And I think that we get tied up in the granularity and the detail. Going into the detail is usually unhelpful. It's like when you go into the detail of the argument with your wife or your husband or whoever, the detail isn't the point, pull back.
Yes.
The detail.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is really going on here? So when people are saying I'm me or am I, and I don't know, and one of the things I think that has certainly transformed the way in which just the TDI works is the is and the want. Because just inviting people to look at the narrative that they have in their head. My preference is this, but actually I would like to be more like this. And because most people have a difference in that, you are opening up their own inner conversation. And that's what we're stimulating. Is it really? Where is it? What's happening? And keeping the being and the doing separate, I think, is a really important part of people not being tied down to their type and, resisting all of those, the thing about, well, you get boxed and you get labeled and things, which you'll never, wanted at all. So don't go down the granularity and the detail route. We've got enough there. People will only take away 2 or 3 things from most things anyway, and use that to ask more questions. So
And how would you, Roy, define personality? What is it?
Okay, I do think it is about how I might typically present myself in a non-coercive environment. but we all have pressures on us. So I see it as, I prefer to use the concept of identity and then saying personality is an element of my identity, which is sort of the preferences and things that feel natural at the moment, sometimes because I haven't developed the behavioral flexibility to, grow out of that. But then, my identity is also my roles. So I like the being and the doing and the roles of the behavior and etc. But values are an important part of it. So I've got all of these elements around identity, and that helps to separate off. It's not values. So let's take those things out of what people generally do. It's not roles and behavior. Let's take that out of it. And what's left is that thing about this sense of how I am naturally when it's non-coercive. And that can change. Through our lifetime, there will be times when I wanted to be action man, and now I want to be reflection and wisdom man.
Yes.
I'm not talking personally here, of course.
Yes. You're moving into the action man phase, are you, Roy?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. And how do you, Roy, see the future of type?
Well, I think it is learning to let go of questionnaires and results in the psychometric area, but not going down this complexity route. So it's about, first of all, I think we need to give people more immediate practical implications for what are done. So a lot of what we do is help and stimulate self-reflection, which is great. And how many people go away and says, yeah, I really do need to think about that. I'll go away and think about that. And then they go on with the day job, So it's giving them practical ways into that. And I should mention at this point that another influence on me was Steve Myers. Steve is not here, but I trained Steve Myers in the MBTI many years ago, and it set him on a path to discover Jung. And that was one of the things in our educational approach to training, was stimulating interest. And so he did that. And then he came back with his role model, which is the MTRI, which we now distribute, etc. But, I have to acknowledge Steve as the sort of author and stimulus. And we brought the TDI and the MTRI together, which is, if you like, this being and the doing. But the MTRI is so immediately practical. You've got 8 roles, which are, and we've changed it from the way Steve had it originally, from being nouns to being action words, because it's what you do. Activate, clarify, So in fact, you can introduce just that model without doing any personality stuff at all and saying, what do you do here? I'm a clarifier. I do clarifying. I like innovating, etc. And he built it into a task process so that those 8 roles, unlike Belbin, which is a role model, bit old-fashioned, I must admit, and not very coherent, and etc. This comes out of theory and captures things which aren't in the Belbin model, and also tells you, before you start any activity, clarify what you're supposed to be doing. And then before you then say, right, let's implement it then, you think, have I understood it well enough? Analyzing. And then instead of going to implementing, you go to, this is helping organizations that are all about results, and say, before you go, now you've understood it, are there other ways that you could do it? Innovating. And then when you've sort of got that, you think, well, there's a lot to be done here. Is it worth it? It's going to cost 5 billion and we're going to get, what is it? Which is the campaigning. And those are the introvert roles. And then you've got the extrovert roles, bring the right people on. So every bit of that is like a process, steps that need to be done. Some are easy to get done because, you're on that path, but most teams just skip over some important parts. So the way I introduce this now is I start with, this is a way in which you could think about what you're doing as a team. What do you bring to it? and there. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's one practical thing that you could do. And I'm sure people have got other practical things. I think, things like interaction styles can be much more practical, etc. So there are ways of doing it. And Kiersey in the years back, used temperament as a way of just capturing, simplifying. But like everything, you mustn't oversimplify. And the danger is that people simplify to start with and then get stuck there. And I think that's what's happened in the psychometric, the personality area. We've got it down. Personality is the big five, and people stop thinking.
Right.
We need to blow it up again. So the change now is, how do we get people who found the word complex, really adopted and loved the simplicity of type as it was, and now to rebuild it into something dynamic, whether it's, who I am and who I want to be, and that conversation, or what I do and why don't I do what I think I ought to be doing,
Yes.
etc.
Yeah. So that's really interesting, the kind of equaling out to the so what, which as a ESFJ I'm very big on. Whenever it's sort of like all of the theories and the concepts are all marvelous, and therefore so what? What's going to be different when I walk out the door or whatever? And just interesting, really interested in what you're saying about the move, if you like, towards pulling things down into a more simplistic framework. And arguably one of the biggest commercial challenges to type in the commercial world, not necessarily working with individuals, but with corporates and so on, is insight. So I'd love your views and thoughts on insights versus type.
Well, insight claims to be a type model. So, and we often have to separate these sort of the practice from the theory. I know that Andy Lothian is quite committed to Jung as a concept, but as Isabel was. But I think both of them lead you to, I am an ENTJ, I am a red, I am a pink, or whatever, and I keep saying, you're down the wrong road now. You're down to closing down to, I seem to be, bending in this direction. And, so how permanent is that? So it's the way it's used. I mean, I do think, I have questions about the insight methodology for getting its colors. So if you like, the underlying measurement, but they've got some nice material, so I can understand how it's seductive. And if you've got good material, Will Schutz said this to me. He said, Roy, do you know, I can sometimes get more value out of tea leaves than these questionnaires. Why? Because it's not that. It's the reaction to what you're saying that is the energy. And so, whether we use tea leaves or insights or MBTI or the TDI, it's the journey that you're on. But I always say, with all of that, if you want to start at the ground floor, do so. But if you use the right questionnaire, asking the right questions, you're starting at floor 5, 6, 7. And the benefit of all of that is not that, I say the prize that we get is we accelerate whatever process we're doing. It's a time dividend rather than all the other stuff that people say, what is the benefit?
Super. So thank you. You are really interesting and inspiring, Roy, and I think we could probably go on for a lot longer. But thank you so much for your time. And I'd love to, just in the last few minutes, to hand back to you, Catherine, and to maybe ask the room any specific questions to Roy.
Yeah, so if anybody would like to ask Roy something, put your hand up or just unmute and speak, or put something quickly in chat. We've sort of got 2 minutes left, I think, of Roy's time and Sarah's time. I'll just pause for a moment just to see if anybody, I can't see everybody, I have to say. So you might just have to unmute and speak if you do have a question. Okay, I'm not seeing any volunteers at the moment. I want to just sort of endorse what Sarah just said. I've been fascinated, and although I've been meant to be hosting this and like keeping an eye on the technical side, I've got 2 pages of notes in front of me here, and all these lovely little phrases that Roy has used, you know, ACDC, the dark matter in organizations, being and doing. I've absolutely really loved this session, and that makes me look forward to Roy's session at the conference even more. Roy's actually involved in 2 things at the conference. He is one of the keynote speakers talking about the 10 myths that are used to berate type, and he's also involved in a panel discussion that Richard Owen is running, where we discuss how to make personality type relevant and so on, I guess, for the 21st century. So any last questions or comments from anybody? Alex, you've unmuted. Does that mean you've got a question? Please go ahead.
A little bit. Hello, Roy. It's nice to meet you for the first time. Actually, Catherine Hirsch was saying I should meet you sometime. So I'm finally getting to meet you. I have a question. It's when you were talking about how we change over time and being and doing, and how you can't just allocate it to doing, but that we're books that over time must change, and if we're not changing, we're quite stuck. That's incorporating Jung's concept of individuation and development. And so my question is part of what you're talking about allowing for continual development and individuation, where you're not trying to confine type down to, well, this is what you are, you know, an ENFJ or an INFP, or but you're this way right now, but you might not be this way a year from now. Is that where you're sort of getting at?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I did a talk at a BAPT thing some time ago on the 5th function, which is about the transcendent function, and how in the end we let go of the opposites, and you know, it becomes, you know, something new, and then develops its own pension of opposites, etc. And so I think that being able to let go of these things is a useful thing. And you know, we can do that too early. I mean, I have seen massive benefit. I remember someone on one of my courses going into a catatonic trance as I was talking about type. And I asked him sort of in the break, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Oh, it's just making so much sense. And I'm realized I'm married to the wrong person." I said, "Wow, okay." And I think it comes back to this thing about how we are quite sort of chaotic or disorganized in terms of thinking of ourselves. The simplification is fantastically useful, but it is a point, a node in the ongoing to reopen it again. And that's the thing. There's nothing wrong with getting down to, you know my type as I'm expressing it now, but how do you open it up again? So it's not, I mean, getting to best fit type, I think, is an appalling sort of thing, you know, because it gets people to almost, because it used to be called true type, getting to true type. You know, no, we're not doing that. We're getting to the story that, you know, where it's led you to in this stage in your life. How's that working for you? And as I say, you're asking people when they say what I want, the introduction of the ideal self, which we all have, and none of us live up to our ideal self. Beginning to open that up gives people the door to the future development, the rest of their life. And don't always think that, you know, the ideal self is actually the ideal. Many people, when they see it in the is want type terms, I don't really want that. You know, so the is want doesn't identify what you want, but it does identify the discussion. It's like all good science and good research leads to better questions, not answers. So most things are leading to that.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Okay.
you, and thank you, Roy, for that extra bit of fantastic information. So I am going to have to draw it to a close, unfortunately. And Roy at the beginning described himself as both a critic of the psychometric approach and an advocate of how useful they can be. And I think he's done enormous justice to both of those aspects today. So I can, only thank you so much, Roy, for giving us such a fantastic session tonight. And thank you, Sarah, as well, for asking such, provoking and stimulating questions. And thanks everybody for attending. Hope to see you at our next webinar, 22nd of February, and of course at our conference, and if you can come to London, at our in-person event as well. So I'm going to stop recording now. If I can find the right button, there